Very quiet now, the large cap space, but the mid caps have come off. In the large cap names, of course, autos and banks, the interest rate sensitives are not doing very well. One sector in focus, though, will now be the telecom sector. It seems now that there will be a JPC in the 2G scam. What could it mean for the sector going forward? Rajiv Chandrashekar, Member of Parliament, joins in to talk about that. Morning, Rajiv. Thanks very much for joining in. What do you think this means for telecom? I mean, a sector where so much regulatory issues are pending. Do you think all of that goes into a freeze while the JPC plays out?
No, I don't think so. I think some of the things that were contentious, the government and the minister has already, and the regulator indeed have woken up and are moving on in terms of pricing of spectrum, additional spectrum and so on. I think what the JPC will do, and if it does it, I hope it does it, is to look at some of the more systemic issues on why the government has broken down on very simple issues like licensing and spectrum allocation and so on and so forth. There are clearly institutional players in the government that have not performed its role, and which is why increasingly investors see telecom and indeed infrastructure as sectors of high regulatory risk. So I hope the JPC goes into, of course, you have to find fault and you have to pin the blame, but also looking at issues of amending of the TRAI Act, strengthening the independent regulatory institutions, creating better oversight on public policy, and all of these issues that are directly relevant to investors, especially long-term investors in sectors like telecom and infrastructure.
Rajiv, morning. Do you think the government can go ahead on contentious issues like spectrum allocation and pricing while a JPC is on without facing very strong opposition from criticism from the opposition?
You see, Mitali, I think the issue with spectrum pricing is only complicated if you try and fix a price to it without allowing a market mechanism to determine it. And I think the minister and the regulator have now woken up to the fact that instead of having so-called experts sit around and decide what the spectrum should be valued at, it is better to have a transparent mechanism of an auction. And they've already said that. So I think that train has left the station, and I don't think there is going to be there is going to be any prejudged value of a spectrum. It will have to be a market mechanism like an auction that will determine the spectrum, and that will go ahead regardless of the JPC.
I think what's making a lot of people wary, Rajiv, is history or precedent in terms of what JPCs suggest or recommend and what actually comes to fruition, compared to what they have to recommend. Are you confident a lot of these issues will get sorted through a JPC itself?
No, I don't think the JPC in itself is a solution, Mitali. I think the fact that the government and the regulator, they always have had a role to play in essentially making this whole process more transparent. They have not done what they were supposed to do. Now they are. I suspect that the chapters on telecom that will be written from here on will be chapters where issues like licensing and spectrum allocation will no longer be the contentious issues. I think the new, this is my confidence, and of course there is going to be cynicism in the markets about this, but I'm very confident about that. I think the issues will be more to do with managing competition, allowing mergers and acquisitions, what will be the minimum level of competition, anti-competitive behavior. And I think those are the sophisticated issues that will now come out to be more relevant in this market than just licensing and spectrum allocation, which, by the way, should have been solved many, many years ago.
Just as a corollary of the previous question, Rajiv, I mean, some of the new TRAI recommendations that you alluded to have come in with for a lot of flack from the incumbent players, the large incumbent players. Do you think they will be implemented in toto at a time when a JPC is underway?
Yeah, see, the JPC doesn't prevent the government from accepting the TRAI recommendations. And, I share some of the anxiety of the investors in telecom that the TRAI recommendations have gone from one extreme to the other extreme without really explaining a rationale or a reason. And it seems to be more political than any economic rationale behind it. So therefore, there are some questions on why the TRAI has woken up belatedly. But having said that, I think every investor in telecom has to wake up to this new truth, which is that there is going to be no more free deal in telecom. Everything will have to be paid for. They will have to view all of this as market-driven, and the old arguments of subsidies and investment need to be backed by government giveaways. That's an old model, and that's gone. I mean, they have to wake up to the new reality that this is going to be completely market-driven, and assets of the government, i.e. spectrum, will be market-priced, market-linked.
The other thing which a lot of investors will fear is the kind of news flow that might come out once the JPC is underway, because already we've seen a lot of adverse news flow to do with specific groups and companies in the market. If this becomes a bit of a witch hunt, more heads are roll both from a political and from a corporate point of view, that might keep the mood in the market quite vitiated for a large number of global watchers. Do you see the possibility of that happening as the JPC gets underway?
I'll tell you, Uday, let's be fairly candid on this. There is a move, and a fairly undilutable move, to get to the bottom of what went wrong and who did the wrong and who were the, let's say, who were the perpetrators of this wrong. And some corporates are going to get caught in this net, and there is no escaping that. And the investors who back those corporates will have to, unfortunately, pay the price. Whether this is ISRO, Devas, and the private equity investors in that franchise, or investors in some of the franchises who've got these licenses in a very questionable way. That is, part of, unfortunately, the due diligence that they should have done. And if they hadn't done that, and they were, riding on a gravy train of some sort, that cost will have to be borne. It's unfortunate, but that's a fact. On the other hand, the investors who back companies who've done this right, who've built out franchises and have attempted to build value through following the old-fashioned conventional way of building valuable franchises, will stand to gain.
Just to approach the question from a different perspective then, Rajiv, without naming names, some of the people who are brought in for questioning have pointed out that they are being picked up because the bigger fish cannot. Is it possible that things will just continue to run parallel, the JPC and the CBI inquiry, where one will probably let the other off, and this will be an exercise in trying to fix the system, but it may not get fixed?
Yeah, I think that's a valid, and I think that is the more valid question that we should be asking. I think, is this going to be just, one of those cover-up, cosmetic movie script kind of processes? But my own intuition, and I have no evidence to, back this up, my own intuition tells me that this one's going to be very, very difficult for the government, or indeed the corporates or the bureaucrats, to sweep under the carpet, because the Supreme Court is there. There are public interest litigants who are fairly determined and credible people like Prashant Bhushan and Dr. Swamy and so on, who are essentially agitating very, very, very comprehensive petitions. So it will be very difficult for people to just come up with a costume drama sort of an investigation. I think there will be a determination. I'm confident. I'm an optimist on these kinds of issues. You can blame me for my optimism. But I believe that it may be a slightly longer process, but we will end up cleaning the system.
In the meantime, while there is any outcome or any suggestion from the JPC, Rajiv, for the industry itself as an observer, do you feel a lot of the black phase is behind them or not yet?
I think so. I think, I think it is clearly now the investors, and I have met a few of them in the last few weeks and months, people who have a long-term view towards India, both the strategic investors and the institutional investors, are looking at this and saying, look, we are now able to understand, the different types of franchises, not just in telecom, in various infrastructure projects. And we understand that there is a slightly more higher level of due diligence that we need to do in terms of the integrity, capability, and the long-term commitment of franchises and promoters before we make these long-term investments and long-term calls in this country. So I think it is good. Of course, there will be some blood that will flow and some pain that will be felt, especially by investors who back the wrong horses. But that's par for the course. I think that's part of something that is normal for markets like this.
So just before we end, you're headed soon to Parliament today, Rajiv. A session will be on. You've heard a final word on this?
Yeah, I'm headed to hear the presidential address. Most presidential addresses leave me fairly cold and unmoved, but I'm hoping this time that the presidential address really lays out some specific steps in governance reforms and creating a sort of a slightly more credible form of government for all of us.
And you've heard an unofficial word at least that a JPC has been agreed to and we'll have a session this time?
Yeah, I think so. I think there will be a JPC, and I think JPC will focus on the systemic issues of what went wrong in the 2G scams and attempt to fix that going forward.
Thanks, Rajiv, for joining in. Appreciate your time today. That's a member of parliament saying that there is a JPC. There will be a parliament session today, and of course, laying out what it could mean for the sector. Meanwhile, the Nifty has bounced back a bit. It's flat now, 2 points higher. The Sensex up 20 points. The mid-cap index is down just about 1/3%. Quiet day for trade. We'll take a break and come back. Talk about maybe the IPO, which is opening today. Mark Faber is also up in just a bit. Don't go away.